How did we go from horses to tanks? From the first time humans tamed the horse around 4000 BC to the first tanks rolling across the battlefield in 1916. That transition took thousands of years of adaptation, experimentation, and failure.
Long before engines, radios, or armored vehicles, horses were the fastest way to move men, messages, and supplies. They carried commanders, scouts, and couriers.
Horses didn't disappear from warfare because they suddenly failed. The battlefield changed.
As weapons and technology advanced, it became more lethal and less forgiving, until horses could no longer survive it.
When that happened, militaries didn't abandon the role that horses once filled. They looked for something that could do the same job.
And we're going to walk through that journey, from the first tamed horses used in combat, to cavalry dominating battlefields for centuries, to the moment horses could no longer keep up, and how tanks ultimately took their place.
Long before horses were used in war, they were already changing the way that people lived and moved. For early humans, horses were first hunted, then herded, and eventually domesticated. They were used to pull loads, move camps, and travel farther in a day than foot movement allowed. They carried people, supplies, and messages, extending how far communities could range and how quickly they could move.
As warfare began to change, horses would eventually find their way into conflict, just not with riders on their backs. Early warfare was slow. Armies moved on foot, and once two horses met, battles often became static. Long, grinding contests where positioning mattered more than maneuver. If you wanted speed, your options were limited.
One of the earliest attempts to solve that problem was the chariot. Chariots were pulled by horses, but they weren't cavalry in the way we think of it today. They functioned more like mobile platforms, carrying archers or commanders, and they depended on flat, open terrain to be effective. They were expensive, fragile, and tied closely to roads, crews, and logistics. Once terrain became uneven, muddy, or broken, chariots quickly lost their advantage.
The real shift in how horses were used in war came when fighters moved off the platform and onto the horse itself. Early mounted riders didn't resemble medieval knights or later cavalry units. Many rode bareback or with simple padding, relying on balance and speed rather than armor protection.
They weren't charging into formations. Instead, they used distance and movement, staying just outside infantry's reach, threatening flanks, probing weaknesses, and breaking contact before a fight could fully develop. Mounted troops began to take on new roles: scouts, messengers, and raiders. They disrupted enemy movement, pressured supply lines, and forced infantry to react to threats they couldn't easily engage.
Infantry couldn't pursue them, and chariots couldn't follow them off roads or flat ground. For the first time, fighters can control the space without holding the ground. That alone was revolutionary.
The impact was immediate. Cavalry spread rapidly across cultures that had no contact with one another. From the Eurasian steppe to the Middle East, from Asia into Europe, armies independently reached the same conclusion. Mounted troops were no longer optional. Any force without cavalry found itself reacting to events instead of shaping them. Always a step behind an enemy that could choose when and where to fight.
Over time, riding equipment evolved to support mounted fighting. Early riders relied mostly on balance and experience, but later developments like saddles, reins, and much later the stirrup made mounted combat increasingly aggressive and reliable. None of these changes happened all at once, but together they transformed early mounted movement into a force that could be used deliberately on the battlefield.
Armies began organizing around it. Campaigns were planned with it in mind. By the time cavalry was fully established, warfare had fundamentally changed. Battles were no longer decided only where armies collided, but by who could move, react, and exploit opportunities faster. And this was just the beginning, because once cavalry proved what movement could do on the battlefield, every civilization began looking for ways to refine it, specialize it, and use it to dominate warfare.
By the time cavalry was fully established, it had become a permanent fixture of warfare across the ancient world. Empires relied on mounted forces to move quickly across vast territories, and respond to threats and project power far beyond their borders. Whether in the Near East, Central Asia, or Europe, armies that could field effective cavalry held decisive advantage over those that could not.
But it was in the medieval period that horse mounted warfare reached its most recognizable and influential form. Improvements in armor, weapons, and riding equipment allowed mounted warriors to survive direct engagement. Riders became more protected. Horses were trained specifically for combat. Cavalry was now designed to break formations and survive the fight that followed.
In medieval Europe, this manifested in the rise of the armored knight. Knights weren't just soldiers, they were the centerpiece of medieval armies. Their training began early in life, their equipment was expensive, and their effectiveness depended on discipline, coordination, and timing. A well executed cavalry charge could shatter infantry formations and break their morale, or even decide a battle within minutes.
Medieval cavalry operated within structured systems. Infantry held ground, archers weakened enemy formations. Cavalry was committed at the critical moment, not as a blunt instrument, but to tip the balance of the fight.
And at the same time, cavalry dominance wasn't limited to Europe. Across the Eurasian steppe, mounted warfare followed a different path. Rather than emphasizing armor and shock, steppe societies focused on mobility and coordination and ranged combat. Entire armies were built around mounted troops, allowing them to fight, maneuver, and sustain campaigns across enormous distances.
Empires like the Mongol Empire demonstrated how devastating cavalry could be when speed, discipline, and operational reach were fully exploited. Their success wasn't tied to castles or fixed defenses. It came from movement, timing, and the ability to strike faster than the enemies could respond.
Despite these differences, the result was the same. By the high medieval period, cavalry dictated how wars were fought, and armies were organized around it. The terrain was chosen with it in mind, and battles were planned around when and where cavalry could be brought to bear.
Cavalry dominance also lasted because countering it was expensive, difficult, and unforgiving. Infantry formations had to be disciplined, well trained, and positioned perfectly to survive a mounted attack. Mistakes were punished immediately. A broken line didn't just lose ground, it collapsed.
At the time, effective counters didn't exist. Dense spear formations, pikes, and later disciplined infantry tactics could blunt a cavalry's charge. But these required cohesion, timing, and leadership under pressure. Against experienced cavalry, even a moment of hesitation could be devastating.
This imbalance mattered. Cavalry didn't just win battles, it shaped who could fight them. Maintaining mounted forces required wealth, infrastructure, and social systems that supported training, breeding, and equipment. In many societies, cavalry became both a military tool and a marker of power, reinforcing its dominance across generations.
But this dominance came with its limits. As weapons improved and formations grew more disciplined, cavalry's margin for error began to shrink. The battlefield was changing again, slowly at first, but in ways that horses would eventually struggle to survive.
Cavalry dominance didn't collapse overnight. For centuries, mounted forces reacted to new enemies, new terrain, and new tactics. But gunpowder introduced a new kind of pressure that horses simply couldn't ride around.
Early firearms didn't immediately replace cavalry. In fact, for a long time, they coexisted. Muskets were slow to reload, inaccurate, and unreliable. Cavalry could still maneuver around them, exploit gaps, and strike at vulnerable moments.
But gunpowder changed the battlefield in a more subtle way. It increased the distance at which soldiers could kill one another. As firearms improved, infantry formations grew denser and more disciplined. Artillery expanded the danger zone even further. Ground that cavalry once crossed with relative freedom became increasingly lethal.
Cavalry adapted again. Mounted troops began fighting dismounted more often. Dragoons emerged as soldiers who rode horses for mobility but fought on foot. Firepower started to matter more than just shock. Mobility was still important, but it no longer guaranteed survival.
This gradual shift continued into the 19th century. Industrialization transformed warfare. Armies grew larger. Logistics became more complex. Railroads dictated movement. Artillery became faster, more accurate, and far more destructive. The battlefield became saturated with fire.
Horses were still used, but their role was shrinking. Cavalry was still useful for things like scouting, screening, and exploiting breakthroughs. But frontal charges became increasingly costly, and mistakes became unforgiving. Speed alone was no longer enough to overcome concentrated fire.
There were also limits that had nothing to do with bullets. This kind of warfare demanded endurance at a level that horses struggled to meet. Feeding, watering, and caring for large numbers of animals became a logistical burden in industrial wars where supply lines were already stretched thin. Horses got tired, they broke down, and they panicked under sustained fire.
As battlefields grew louder, more chaotic, and more lethal, horses became harder to control and easier to lose. Artillery didn't just kill the riders, it scattered the mounts. It disrupted formations and left units immobile. Cavalry force didn't have to be destroyed to be neutralized, it only had to lose its horses.
This created a new problem. Armies still needed speed and maneuver, but they needed it in a form that could endure constant fire, operate for long periods, and be sustained by industrial logistics, not biology. Speed without protection, movement without endurance, and courage without cover were no longer enough.
By the time World War I began, the balance had finally tipped. Machine guns, rapid fire artillery, and modern rifles created kill zones that horses simply couldn't survive. Open ground, once the domain of cavalry, turned into a death trap. Early attempts to use mounted troops offensively resulted in devastating losses.
And yet, cavalry didn't disappear. Horses were still valuable for transport, reconnaissance, and logistics, especially in terrain where vehicles struggled. But their ability to decide battles had largely vanished. The battlefield had outgrown them.
World War I made something clear. Armies still needed mobility. They still needed a way to break stalemates and still needed to move through fire. But horses could no longer do that job effectively. The problem cavalry once solved hadn't gone away. What disappeared was the horse's ability to survive in the battlefield. Armies were left with a role that still needed to be filled, and if horses could no longer fill that role, the question was what could replace it.
By the middle of World War I, it was clear that horses could no longer break the battlefield. Trenches stretched for miles, barbed wire blocked movement, machine guns and artillery dominated open ground. Infantry could advance, but once they did, they were pinned in place. Mobility, the thing cavalry once provided, had vanished.
Armies weren't looking for a better horse, they were looking for something that could move under fire.
The tank emerged as an answer to that problem. Early tanks were crude machines. They were slow, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to control. Crews had limited visibility. Coordination of infantry was often improvised. But they could cross terrain horses couldn't survive. Shell holes, wire, mud, all while shielding their crews from small arms fire.
In World War I, tanks weren't war winning weapons yet. They were support tools. Their purpose was to restore movement, not to dominate the battlefield. But even in limited numbers, they forced a new reality. Protection had become more important than speed alone.
That realization didn't come easily. Early tanks frustrated commanders as much as they impressed them. They broke down, they bogged down, they were difficult to supply, and hard to integrate into existing plans.
But despite their flaws, tanks offered something nothing else could: the ability to move forward under fire and stay there. Unlike cavalry, they didn't panic. Unlike infantry, they weren't instantly pinned down by machine guns. Even when they failed in ways that pointed towards a solution, not a dead end.
That mattered because for the first time since cavalry's decline, armies had a tool that could survive the battlefield long enough to shape it.
After the war, militaries took notice. During the interwar years, armies across the world experimented with how tanks should be used. Some treated them as mobile artillery, meant to support infantry. Others began to explore the idea of armored formations capable of independent maneuver.
At the same time, traditional cavalry didn't disappear overnight. Many units are partially mechanized, operating alongside armored cars and early tanks. The transition from horse to engine was uneven, shaped by budgets, culture, and doctrine.
World War II resolved many of those debates. Tanks proved they could do what cavalry once had: exploit breakthroughs, pursue retreating forces, operate deep behind enemy lines, but on a far more lethal battlefield. Armor, engines, and radios allowed formations to move faster, coordinate better, and fight through resistance rather than around it.
By the end of the war, the shift was undeniable. Cavalry as a horse mounted battlefield force was gone. In its place stood armored formations designed to maneuver, break defenses, and sustain operations over long distances.
After World War II, tanks continued to evolve. In Korea, armor faced difficult terrain and extreme weather, but remained essential. In Vietnam, however, tanks played a more limited role, yet still provided firepower and protection when conditions allowed it. Through the Cold War, tank design focused on survivability, firepower, and the ability to fight in a high intensity mechanized conflict.
And by the late 20th century, the transformation was complete. The battlefield role once filled by cavalry now belonged entirely to armored forces. What remained was to see how that role would be executed in the modern era, and how far tanks would carry the legacy of the horse. By the late 20th century, the transition was complete. The battlefield role, once filled by cavalry at the beginning of the century, was now executed entirely by armored forces.
Nowhere was this more apparent than in the United States. American armored doctrine evolved around a simple reality: the US did not fight short, localized wars, it fought across continents. It meant that armor forces had to move at long distances, operate for extended periods of time, integrate with other branches, and be sustained at scale. Mobility alone wasn't enough. Endurance is what mattered.
This reality shaped modern American armor. Rather than pursuing the heaviest possible vehicle, US tank design emphasized balance. Firepower, protection, mobility, and logistics were treated as interdependent. A tank was not designed to operate independently. It was built to function inside a combined system, moving with infantry, supported by aviation, and sustained by logistics from the start.
That approach solidified during the Cold War. Armored units were structured to fight in high intensity mechanized warfare against peer forces. Tanks were no longer specialized breakthrough tools. They became the backbone of maneuver formations, expected to advance, hold ground, and exploit success, and remain operational under constant pressure.
By the time the Abrams entered service, this model was fully mature. The Abrams was not revolutionary in concept, but it was optimized for the role it was meant to fill. It combined mobility, survivability, and firepower in a platform designed to operate continuously. Its effectiveness depended as much on fuel, maintenance, and crew training as on armor and weapons.
That design philosophy was validated in combat. In conflicts like the Gulf War, American armored forces demonstrated what modern execution looked like. Tanks maneuvered at operational speeds that compressed decision timelines and denied the enemy the ability to recover. Success was driven by coordination, information, and tempo, not by isolated engagements.
Modern armored units don't simply respond to contact, they create pressure. By moving decisively, they force enemy displacement, disrupt command and control, and shape the battlefield before decisive fighting occurs. Speed still matters, but it now exists alongside protection, situational awareness, and sustained presence.
Where earlier forces relied on direct observation and limited communication, armored units now operated with continuous awareness. Sensors, intelligence feeds, and integrated fires allowed commanders to see farther, decide faster, and commit forces deliberately rather than reactively.
That responsibility comes with constraints. Modern tanks are expensive, logistically demanding, and highly visible. They require fuel, maintenance, trained crews, and constant support. On a battlefield saturated with sensors and precision weapons, armored forces cannot operate carelessly or alone.
Even so, they remained essential. In conflicts where terrain or political conditions limited large scale armored maneuver, tanks continued to provide capabilities that no other system could fully replace. In urban environments and irregular warfare, they offered protective firepower, physical presence, and the ability to dominate contested ground under fire.
As warfare continues to evolve, armored units still persist not because of tradition, but because they still fulfill a role that no other platform can reliably absorb.
Today, that lineage is clear. Modern armored units still perform missions once assigned to cavalry: reconnaissance, exploitation, rapid response, and decisive engagement. The platforms have changed, but the battlefield role has remained remarkably consistent.
Drones now scout where mounted riders once rode ahead. Satellites provide the awareness cavalry patrols once gathered. Tanks and mechanized forces move where horses once carried warriors.
The transformation from cavalry to armor wasn't a break from history. What changed wasn't the need for decisive movement, it was how that movement was delivered.
Steel replaced muscle, engines replaced endurance, and networks replaced messengers. But the role itself never disappeared. It was the continuation of it.